Tonight, the Kansas Young Republicans chapter is shut down by state GOP leaders after a report by Politico claims that the chapter's chair and vice chair were a part of racist group chats. The report published today reveals leaked conversations between leaders of young Republican groups across the country, making remarks targeting African Americans, Jews, and other minorities. Ana Valdez joins us from the newsroom with what local lawmakers are now saying about the situation. Ana?
Rachel, we've been hearing from several Republican lawmakers. They tell us they condemn these actions by Chair Alex Dwyer and Vice Chair William Hendricks. Hendricks had previously worked with Kansas Attorney General Chris Kobach's office. In a statement to 12 News, Kobach's office said the comments are inexcusable and that Hendricks was terminated as soon as they became aware of the messages. The chair of the Kansas Republican Party also responded to the Politico story, saying the party leadership is disgusted and that the views expressed in the chats do not reflect the beliefs of Kansas Republicans as a whole. The Kansas Young Republicans organization is now inactive. We also spoke with the Kansas Young Democrats, who say they condemn the messages as well and are encouraging the public to ask, where are these young Republicans learning this kind of behavior?
I would encourage everyone to also think about where these young Republicans learned this rhetoric from. If there's an issue with a faction within their party, it's clear that there are some other things happening within the leadership of the Kansas Republican Party as well.
We reached out to William Hendricks and Alex Dwyer, but did not receive a comment back. We also tried to contact the Kansas Young Republicans, but did not receive a response. Rachel?
Ana, thank you. Turning now